pup wasn't breathing when the tide first pushed him up the sand, and the only witness was a man who had stopped believing in second chances a long time ago. It was the gray hour before sunrise on the Oregon coast, when the fog still sat on the water like something tired and unwilling to lift. Within a week, that half-drowned scrap of a dog would do what no grief counselor, no chaplain, no well-meaning neighbor with a casserole had managed to do in 2 long years. He would crack open a closed-up man and a closed-up town and let the light back in. If you've ever loved something you couldn't save, stay with this one. And wherever you're watching from this morning, leave the name of your town in the comments, because this story belongs to everyone who knows what an empty house sounds like. Cormac Delaney walked the jetty at Harlow Bay every dawn. Not because he wanted to, but because the alternative was lying in a bed that still felt too wide on one side. He was 57, broad through the shoulders even now, with gray stubble he forgot to shave and a limp in his right hip that the damp made worse. 22 years he'd given the Navy, most of them as a SEAL, the kind of work he never talked about, and the kind of work that left a man fluent in silence. People in town knew him as the quiet one in the green oilskin coat who nodded but didn't stop. They didn't know about Annie. Annie had been gone 2 years that November. Pancreatic cancer, the fast and merciless kind. 16 weeks from the diagnosis to the morning, the hospice nurse closed the bedroom door softly behind her. They'd had 31 years. She'd been the talker, the one who filled rooms, who left notes in his boots and sang off-key to the radio while she cooked. After she died, the house didn't just go quiet. It went deaf. He'd kept her reading glasses on the kitchen windowsill because moving them felt like a betrayal. And he'd kept walking the jetty because his old K9, a sable shepherd named Diesel he'd served with overseas, used to love the smell of the surf, and Diesel was 12 years in the ground now too. And somehow grief stacked on grief until a man stopped being able to tell one loss from another. That morning the foghorn at the point was groaning its slow 2-note warning, and underneath it Cormac heard something that didn't belong. A thin, broken sound. Not the gulls, not the wind. He stopped, which he almost never did, and looked down the slope of wet rock to the tide line. A milk crate, the orange plastic kind, had washed up half buried in kelp and foam, and tangled in the slats was a puppy. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 weeks old. A German shepherd, by the look of the oversized paws, and the black mask just starting to come in over a coat the color of wet straw. Somebody had zip-tied the crate shut and thrown it off a boat or a bridge, and the sea, which takes most things it's handed, had for some reason decided to give this one back. The pup was limp, his ribs barely moving, salt water draining from his muzzle, and then, as Cormac crouched there in the cold with his bad hip screaming, the little thing made a sound again. Not a whimper. Something stranger. A low warbling grumble that rose at the end like a question, like the pup was arguing with the ocean and losing and refusing to admit it. Something in Cormac's chest, a door he'd kept bolted, shifted on its hinge. He got the pocket knife out, sawed through the ties, and lifted the dog into the front of his coat against his own heartbeat the way he'd once carried wounded men. "Easy," he said, and his voice came out rough from disuse. "Easy now. You're done with the water." He pressed 2 fingers below the pup's jaw, found the flutter of a pulse, and tipped the small head down to let the rest of the sea run out. The pup coughed, shuddered, and then, instead of crying like any half-drowned animal would, he turned his face up toward Cormac's chin and let out a long, wavering hum, warm and complaining and astonishingly human, as if he were telling the whole sorry story of his night and expecting an apology for it. Cormac, who had not laughed in 2 years, made a sound that surprised him. "You've got opinions," he said. "Lord help me, he carried him the half-mile back up the bluff and didn't put him down once." Doc Renata Voss ran the only veterinary clinic in Harlow Bay, a converted feed store off the harbor road, and she opened early for him because Cormac Delaney had never once in 2 years asked anyone for anything. And a man like that showing up at your door with a dying puppy in his coat is not a thing you make wait. She was 50, calm-handed, with reading glasses pushed up into iron-gray hair and the unhurried steadiness of someone who had midwifed and euthanized half the animals in the county. She warmed fluids, cleared the lungs, checked for the things that kill puppies fast, and found, to her own quiet surprise, none of them. Dehydrated, hypothermic, a little anemic, she said, working, But no breaks, no parvo signs, no bloat. Somebody wanted him dead, and the water disagreed. She glanced at the pup, who had begun, even shivering under the heat lamp, to hum and chirp and grumble at her thermometer with the wounded dignity of a small king. She paused. "Now that I've never heard." "He's been doing it since the beach," Cormac said. She listened a moment longer. The pup gave a short, indignant yodel when she touched his ear, then a soft, settling rumble the instant Cormac murmured his name. Renata looked from the dog to the man and back. "He quits when you talk," she said. "Most dogs do. Not like that." She wrote something on her chart and didn't say it out loud, but she thought it. This one isn't listening to the words. He's listening to the person. She had seen 10,000 animals. She had not seen many souls. Cormac hadn't planned on naming him. Names were how you got attached, and being attached was how you ended up standing in a cemetery in the rain. But while Renata stepped out to draw up another syringe, the pup looked up at him with eyes too gold and too old for that little body, and let out one more soft, plucking string of notes, and Cormac thought of the instrument his father used to play on the porch in Tennessee, 100 years ago, the one whose twang carried clear across the holler. "Banjo," he said before he could stop himself. The pup's ears went up. He gave one sharp, certain bark, as if the name had always been his and he'd just been waiting for the slow human to catch up. Renata, hearing it from the next room, smiled at the wall. Word of the strange talking pup moved through Harlow Bay, the way everything moved through Harlow Bay, fast and seasoned with embellishment. By the end of the first week, Cormac's quiet house had visitors it hadn't seen since the funeral. The first was a kid named Toby from the high school, who'd heard from his cousin, who'd heard from Doc Voss's receptionist, and who showed up with a phone in his hand and the nervous courtesy of a teenager not sure if he'd get yelled at. The second was Buck Lindquist, who ran the boat repair shed at the marina and who'd known Cormac's late wife and had been the only man at the funeral, with the sense not to say anything dumb. Buck was 63, built like a dock piling, with hands permanently stained by engine grease, and a gray walrus mustache that had intimidated 3 decades of harbor seals. He complained about everything that drew breath: the weather, the price of diesel, the Coast Guard, summer people, and especially anyone who called him before noon. He arrived at Cormac's door, holding a thermos and pretending he'd just been passing by, which was a lie because nothing in Harlow Bay was on the way to Cormac's house. "Heard you fished a noisy one out of the drink," Buck said. Banjo, 3 weeks stronger now, his coat brushed and his black saddle filling in, pressed his nose through the porch rail and let out 3 eager squeaks. Buck squinted down at him. "Skinny little thing. Big mouth on him, though," he sniffed. "Reminds me of the harbor master." But Cormac noticed that the old man crouched, despite his knees, and that when Banjo licked his grease-stained thumb, something in Buck's perpetually suspicious face came unclenched for a second. And Cormac understood that Buck Lindquist had been just as lonely as he was, and had simply been better at hiding it behind a mustache. The one who changed everything, though, was Eli. Eli Cardenas was 25 and back in Harlow Bay, because back in Harlow Bay was the only place left. He'd done 2 tours, come home with a Purple Heart he kept in a sock drawer, and a startle reflex he couldn't explain to anyone, and he'd been pumping gas at the marina and not sleeping, and not calling his mother back. Cormac knew the look. He'd worn it himself once, a younger version of the same haunting. The day Eli came by to drop off a part for Buck, a chain dropped off the bench in the shed and rang against the concrete, and Eli's whole body flinched the way a body flinches when it's certain, for 1 animal half-second, that it's about to die. Banjo crossed the floor before anyone moved. He didn't bark. He didn't jump. He walked straight to Eli, sat against his boot and began to hum, low, even, steady, a sound with weight to it, the kind of sound you could lean on. Eli looked down, and the color came slowly back into his face, and his trembling hand went still on the workbench. "That's—" Eli started and couldn't finish. Renata, who'd come by with worming meds, watched it happen and said quietly, "He's not reacting to the noise." She crouched, her voice gentle. "He's reacting to you, Eli." Cormac said nothing. He didn't like how fast that sentence found the bruise in his own chest, because the truth was that the night before, he'd been sitting at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning, with Annie's reading glasses in his hand, and the bad thoughts circling close, and Banjo had climbed into his lap uninvited, and pressed one paw flat against his sternum, right over the heart, and held it there and hummed until the circling thoughts gave up and went home. Cormac had not told anyone that. He wasn't sure he ever would. But he'd gotten up the next morning and shaved, for the first time in a while, and that was its own kind of confession. The fog rolled out of Harlow Bay and the days got shorter, and Banjo grew into his paws, and a boy named Toby kept a phone in his pocket. It was the night of the November gale that did it. A crab boat lost steering 2 miles off the point and called in a mayday, and half the town came down to the harbor to watch the Coast Guard launch into the dark, the way coastal towns do, because everyone on that water is somebody's husband or daughter. The foghorn was going and the rain was sideways, and the radio in the harbor master's shack was crackling with the rescue swimmer's voice, and the whole crowd stood frozen and praying. And Eli was there, white-knuckled, fighting the old panic, and Cormac stood beside him with a hand on his shoulder, and Banjo stood at the seawall, and Banjo lifted his head and answered the foghorn. It wasn't a howl. It was something fuller and stranger, a long rising and falling note braided into the horn's two-tone groan, a harmony, a dog singing back to the dark the way the dark was singing at the sea, and the crowd, who an hour earlier had been a wall of clenched fear, began to breathe. Somebody laughed, a startled wet sound. A fisherman's wife put her hand to her mouth. The boat came in safe 20 minutes later, all 3 crew aboard, and people said afterward, half joking, half not, that the dog had sung them home. Toby filmed 40 seconds of it. The seawall, the rain, the horn, the puppy with his nose to the storm singing. He posted it for his cousins and went to bed. By morning it had 300,000 views. By the second day it had 4 million, and the comment sections of the world had cracked open like an egg over Harlow Bay. Veterans wrote that they hadn't cried in years until a half-drowned puppy answered the exact sound that still lived in their nightmares. A widow in Maine wrote that her husband used to hum to their old shepherd every morning, and she'd forgotten the sound of it until now. People wrote blessings. People wrote that they'd watched it 40 times. People wrote the names of dogs they'd buried decades ago. Somebody called him the little voice of Harlow Bay, and the phrase went everywhere. Toby came to Cormac's door, pale and stammering, holding up his phone like a piece of evidence at his own trial. "Mr. Delaney," he said, "I think your dog is famous." Cormac, who had spent his entire adult life learning that the things you love attract the attention of people who want to take them, felt a cold he couldn't name. He was right to. She came on the 4th day, in a rental SUV that didn't belong on the harbor road, in a coat that cost more than Buck's boat. Sloan Whitfield, talent and brand acquisitions for a content agency out of Los Angeles, with a tablet, a smile that never reached her eyes, and a folder of papers she set on Cormac's kitchen table like she already owned it. "Mr. Delaney," she said, "Banjo is a once-in-a-decade property." Property. The word landed in the room like a dropped wrench. She talked fast and well. She talked about platforms and partnerships and a studio in Los Angeles, a trainer, a vet on retainer, merchandise, a docuseries, numbers with a lot of zeros. She talked about how she could make this little dog a household name, how she'd be doing him a favor, how a stray with no microchip and no formal ownership was, frankly, anybody's, and how much simpler it would be if Cormac signed. She never once asked the dog's name without reading it off her tablet first. "He'd be cared for at the highest level," Sloan said. "He'd reach millions. You'd be a fool to keep him on a fishing dock." Banjo sat under the table the whole time with his ears back, and he did not hum, and Cormac understood that the dog read her exactly the way the dog read everyone. "He's not for sale," Cormac said. "Everything's for sale," Sloan said pleasantly, "and a court might have questions about who he belongs to. Sleep on it." She left her card and her folder, and the SUV crunched back down the gravel, and the house went very quiet. And for the first time in a long time Cormac was not alone in it, because Banjo climbed into his lap and pressed that paw against his chest and hummed. And Cormac said into the gray fur, "I'm not going to let her take you, kid. I let too much get taken already." It might have ended there, an old man and a lawyer and a fight over a famous dog, if not for a cream-colored envelope that came 2 days later, addressed in pencil, in the careful, shaking hand of a child. The return address read Junie Pratt, Tillamook County. Cormac almost didn't open it. The mail had become a flood. Letters forwarded by Toby, by the Coast Guard Auxiliary, by strangers who'd found his name online, and he'd stopped reading most of it. But the pencil on this one was so careful, so labored, the way a hand shakes not from carelessness, but from courage being forced onto paper, that he sat down at the kitchen table with Annie's reading glasses on the sills beside him and slid it open. Inside was a single sheet of lined notebook paper and a small photograph. The photo showed a thin girl, maybe 8, with 2 crooked braids and front teeth she hadn't grown into yet, standing on a porch beside a stooped older woman with kind, exhausted eyes. On the back, in an adult's handwriting, Junie and Grandma Nora, first Christmas after Mama. The letter read, "Dear Mr. Dellaway, I spelled your name wrong probably. My name is Junie Pratt and I am 8. My Grandma Nora says when you can't say a thing out loud you can write it. My mama was named Dana Pratt and she fished on the St. Ardith out of Garibaldi. There was a storm last March and the boat went down and they didn't find her. I don't talk much anymore because every word is heavy. Grandma says that's okay, grief. Isn't rude, it's just tired. I saw the video of your dog singing to the foghorn and I don't know why, but it sounded like he knew about the ocean taking people. It made me feel like maybe my sad isn't stuck inside me forever. Can you tell Banjo thank you? I think he understood something I can't explain. From Junie." Cormac read it once. He read it twice. By the 3rd time the words had gone to water in front of him, and he took the glasses off and pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes, and Banjo came and put his head on the man's knee and made the softest sound, a sound like he'd felt the whole grieving weight of that little letter pass through Cormac before Cormac had said a word. "You're reaching people we'll never meet, dog," Cormac whispered. Renata read the letter that evening, standing in his kitchen, and her professional calm cracked clean down the middle. "This," she said, holding the page, "this is what I've been trying to say. He's not a trick. He's not a property." She looked up. "He gives a shape to the thing people can't carry. That child in that letter, she heard the ocean take her mother, and she heard your dog answer it, and for 1 minute she wasn't alone with it." Renata folded the letter the way you fold a bandage over a wound. "Sloane Whitfield wants to put that on a billboard. We can't let her." "How do you fight a lawyer with a folder?" Cormac said. Buck, who'd let himself in without knocking and was leaning in the doorway with his thermos, cleared his throat. "You don't fight her with a folder," he said. "You fight her with a town." They fought her with a town. Buck knew every harbor rat and chowder house owner and retired deputy from Astoria to Newport, and Renata knew every animal-loving soul who'd ever brought a sick cat through her door, and Toby, it turned out, knew the internet. Within a week there was a microchip in Banjo's shoulder, registered to Cormac Delaney, and an affidavit from Doc Voss documenting the rescue, and a statement from the harbor master who'd watched Cormac carry the half-drowned pup up the bluff, and a letter, pages and pages, of signatures from the people of Harlow Bay declaring that the dog belonged to the man who'd pulled him from the sea and to nobody in California with a tablet. But the thing that finished it wasn't legal. Toby posted Junie's letter, with the grandmother's permission, with the spelling and all, and he posted Cormac reading it at his kitchen table, an old seal who'd buried a wife and a war and a dog, and finally couldn't hold his face together over a child's pencil. And the same internet that had made Banjo a property looked at that and remembered what he actually was. The comments turned. People wrote to Sloane Whitfield's agency by the thousands. A brand is a thing you can own, a miracle isn't, and the public, for once, knew the difference. Sloane stopped returning Toby's messages. The folder on Cormac's table gathered dust and then went in the wood stove, and the night it burned, Buck brought beer, and Renata brought pie, and Eli brought himself. Which was the harder thing, and they sat in a kitchen that had been deaf for 2 years and was suddenly impossibly full of voices. Banjo went from lap to lap collecting tribute. Annie's reading glasses still sat on the windowsill, catching the light, and Cormac looked at them and thought she'd have liked this. All these people, all this noise, and the thought didn't gut him the way it would have a month before. It just ached, the way a healed bone aches when the weather turns. He drove out to Tillamook County the next Saturday with Banjo riding shotgun. Nora Pratt's farmhouse sat at the end of a muddy lane, gray-shingled and stubborn against the wind, and Junie was on the porch when the truck pulled in, and she went very still the way a child goes still when she's afraid to want something too much. Cormac came around and opened the passenger door and Banjo poured out of the cab and crossed the yard like he'd lived there all his life, and walked straight up the porch steps and sat down in front of the thin girl with the crooked braids, and looked up at her and hummed. Junie dropped to her knees and put her face in his fur, and her grandmother put a hand over her own mouth, and the only sound for a long moment was the wind and the dog, and, finally, after 8 months of a silence that had scared everyone who loved her, a small wet broken laugh from a little girl who had forgotten she knew how. "He understood," she whispered into Banjo's neck. "I told you he understood." Cormac and Nora stood at the bottom of the steps and didn't say much, the way two people who've both lost the center of their lives don't always need to. "She hasn't talked since March," Nora said finally, quiet. "Not real talking. Her teacher called me. The doctor wanted to put her on something. She watched the girl and the dog. And your dog drives up my road and she stopped." She couldn't finish. She didn't have to. He hadn't planned what came next. It arrived the way the dog's name had arrived, from somewhere older than thought. He'd been turning it over the whole drive and pretending he hadn't. Banjo was his. Banjo had pulled him back from the edge of a kitchen table at 3 in the morning, had given him a reason to shave, to answer the door, to walk the jetty for the living instead of the dead. Letting him go would tear something. But Cormac had spent 2 years learning the difference between love that holds on and love that gives, and he knew which kind Annie had been, and he knew which kind this little girl needed more than he did. "He likes the chicken better than kibble," Cormac said, his voice not quite steady. "Spoiled rotten, and he doesn't sleep unless somebody's heart is close." He crouched and scratched the uneven ears one more time. "But I think he came a long way to find you, kid. I think maybe that was always the whole idea." Junie looked up, not understanding, and then understanding, and her eyes filled. "You'd give him to me?" "I think he gave himself to you," Cormac said. "I just drove the truck." They worked it out the sensible way over coffee, because Nora was too proud to take charity, and Cormac was too smart to call it charity. A sharing, a both-houses arrangement. Banjo with Junie through the school year and a standing welcome for an old man and his truck whenever the loneliness got loud. Renata, when she heard, set Junie up with the first simple training to be a proper therapy dog, video calls twice a week, the girl's solemn gray eyes lighting up every single time. Eli drove out to help with the fencing, and came back 3 more times after that, and started sleeping through the night. Buck built a doghouse nobody asked for, sturdy and ugly and indestructible, and carved a sign for it that read, in letters that wandered uphill, "Kindness is still a job worth doing," and hung it over the door and dared anyone to comment. The town that had fought a lawyer to keep a dog discovered it had, in the fighting, become a town again. A year passed the way years do on the coast, in fog and squall and the occasional unreasonable blue morning. Banjo grew into a strong young shepherd with a deep black saddle and a chest like a barrel, and the same crooked, complaining voice he'd had as a half-drowned scrap in a crate. Junie talked. She talked all the time now, her grandmother said, talked the windows loose, and she walked Banjo to the school bus every morning, and he sat at the end of the lane until the bus was out of sight. She'd started visiting the senior home in town with him, the girl who couldn't speak now, coaching a dog who gave grief a sound, and old folks who'd stopped looking up from their laps, looked up when Banjo came down the hall and hummed. Cormac drove out to Tillamook on a gray November Saturday, a year almost to the day from the morning the tide had handed him a miracle he hadn't asked for. He came in his green oilskin coat. Junie was in the yard throwing a red ball, laughing, taller now, her front teeth grown in, and Banjo bounded through the wet grass after it. No longer the trembling pup from the beach, but a creature wholly at home in the world. Nora stood on the porch, with her cheeks pink from the cold, and she did not look like a woman cured of her grief, because grief is not a thing you cure, but she looked like a woman accompanied through it, which, Cormac had come to believe, was sometimes the closer thing to holy. He'd brought something with him. He'd carried it in his coat pocket the whole drive, the way he'd once carried the pup. It was Diesel's old tag, the brass worn smooth, the dog he'd served beside overseas, the partner who'd shoved him clear of a blast a lifetime ago and not made it home himself. He'd kept it in a drawer for 12 years because keeping it in a drawer was the only way he'd known to grieve. He walked to Buck's ugly, indestructible doghouse with its uphill sign and he knelt, his bad hip protesting, and he fastened the worn brass tag to the post beneath. Kindness is still worth doing, where it caught the thin gray light. Banjo trotted over and pressed against his legs and looked up at him, and Cormac put his hand on the broad young head. "You brought me home, too," he said quietly, and he wasn't entirely sure, kneeling there, whether he meant Banjo or Diesel or Annie or all of them at once. All the love he'd lost and all the love that had come back wearing fur and 4 big paws and a voice that wouldn't quit. Out across the fields the wind carried the far, faint 2-note groan of the foghorn at Harlow Point. The same horn that had been groaning the morning Cormac found a dying dog in the surf. Banjo lifted his head. He'd answered that horn a year ago in a storm with the whole town holding its breath. He answered it now, in the cold, clear afternoon, with a little girl laughing behind him and an old man's hand on his head and a brass tag swinging gentle in the breeze. Answered it not to fear now, not to the dark, but to the simple living going on all around him. A long, rising, crooked, beautiful note, sung to the bells of an ordinary day. Junie laughed and clapped. Nora wiped her eyes on the back of her wrist, and Cormac Delaney, who had walked the jetty for the dead for 2 long years, stood up in the wet grass and found that he was smiling, and that the smile didn't cost him anything, and that the empty side of the bed at home had stopped feeling quite so wide. The miracles that matter most rarely come with thunder. Sometimes they come small and half-drowned and zip-tied into a crate the sea decides, against all reason, to give back. Sometimes they come in a child's first laugh in 8 months, or an old mechanic's ugly homemade sign, or a young veteran finally sleeping through the night, or a widower who shaves one morning for no reason he can name. None of us is likely to pull a singing puppy out of the surf, but every one of us walks past somebody who's drowning quiet, and a kind word, a phone call, a meal left on a porch, a little patience held out to a person too tired to ask. Any of it might be the tide that hands a life back. Banjo was never going to be anyone's property. He became something far harder to own and far more worth keeping. He became a home for hearts that had forgotten the way back to one. And on the coast, when the fog comes in and the horn begins to groan, the people of Harlow Bay still tell the children that if you listen close, you can hear a dog singing the lost one's home.